Namaskar. This is my 50th lecture and it has to be listened in the context of the 49th lecture, where I talked about how there are prohibitions against talking about sexual violence, and the same thing happens with Hindu genocide. Just as there are prohibitions against talking about sexuality, sexual violence, so it's the same thing with the Hindu genocide. What is happening now in Bangladesh and what has happened in 1971, what has happened in 1964, and all throughout in East Pakistan. So I'll introduce another concept and then I'll relate it. It is also a psychoanalytic concept, and I'm going to specifically say why those who are progressive left, why they are reluctant to talk about this genocide. And I'm going to talk about Freud's theory of anxiety. Okay, so what is anxiety? Anxiety is, I'm reading this, is a fear of threats, real world threats or neurotic threats. There are three types of anxiety that Freud talks about. There is a rational fear based on a perceived external threat, being afraid of dangerous animals approaching you and so forth. That's a real anxiety. You are in a position where your life will be threatened. The neurotic anxiety, this anxiety comes from a conflict between the id's impulse and the ego's attempt to control them. That the id will come out as aggressive or very pleasure seeker, but the ego, which balances between the superego, which is the moral constraint of human beings according to Freud. For example, sexuality. The id is saying, I want to have sex with this person. That's his instinct. The superego is saying, no, you cannot ever. And the ego is balancing the two. So when that happens, the id is trying to say something, maybe a kind of hatred, but the ego is suppressing it. And then there is moral anxiety. It stems from the fear of going against one's internal moral compass, causing guilt or shame for actions that might not align with one's values. I think why so many progressive people who talk about the Nazi Holocaust and so forth are reluctant to talk about the Hindu genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the Holocaust, say the Bengalis or the Kashmiris, the ethnic cleansing of the Sindhis, etc., is more this moral anxiety. And what is this moral anxiety? That the internal superego, the one where we are taught morality, that silences it. Where did we get it? Again, going back to lecture 49, we said that it comes internally. See, that's the thing with psychoanalysis. Everything is internal. The superego is internal. We internalize the parental control. So the parents are within us. It's exactly what Foucault says about the state. The modern disciplinary state is not out there. It's inside of us. It disciplines us every moment. The same with this moral compass. What is the moral anxiety? That I have been taught to not to speak about certain cultures and them as perpetrators. I'm going to always talk about those cultures as victims. And this is what I have been taught. That is exactly the Nietzsche's herd morality. They cannot do critical thinking and go beyond the herd morality and recreate the values. Our moral values, right, wrong, good or bad, all these are what we learn in society. They are not eternal values. And a master morality, according to Nietzsche, is one who takes those values, right, wrong, good, bad, and they recreate them. So just because I've been taught that something, you cannot talk about something, so I'm following what my party orders. This is the moral anxiety coming from. Where the moral anxiety comes from. What is the moral anxiety? This stems from the fear of going against one's internal moral compass, causing guilt or shame that might not align with one's values. For example, someone in the Communist Party, they are taught that you can only speak about victims when they are of this identity, and this identity. You can only talk about perpetrators when they're Europeans, etc., etc. That's okay to talk about it. But you cannot go beyond that. And that's the value that they have been taught. Just as we are taught that you can talk about rape when it's happened externally, but you cannot talk about incestual rape, or you cannot talk about marital rape. And we internalize those values. And then we follow them. Just as the party said that when the Hindu is the victim and the Muslim is the perpetrator, you cannot talk about it. And we have internalized the values. So what is the herd morality here? That's exactly the slave morality. We follow what we have been taught. We don't think critically. That things are different in Africa. There have been Arab colonization, and everyone can be a colonizer and a colonized. Yes, and women can also be abusers of children, etc. And that's the critical thinking that's absent. This moral anxiety is what is preventing them from speaking out about the genocide that has happened. And we went through the definition of genocide earlier as killing, not only killing of people, but the intent is the destruction of an entire group of ethnicity and the entire civilization. And when they come face to face with it, they cannot accept it. So what do? They repress. And there's silence there. It happens in therapy. Someone's speaking about their childhood, whatever, and there are gaps and silences. And a good therapist would also interpret not what the client is saying, but the silences also. This is very important. Now, there are a couple of things here, how we relate it a little bit further with gender identity. Freud, in the beginning of his life, and I talked about this a lot in my videos, only talked about the libido or the pleasure principle. That since childhood, we are always seeking pleasure. And that goes throughout our development. The oral stage where we seek pleasure through the mouth, the anal stage where we seek pleasure through passing of the feces, and then the genital stage where the male child seeks pleasure by masturbating. The female child, it's different. So it's the pleasure principle that guides our development, the search for infinite pleasure. But at the genital stage, the child realizes if he has to have a consolidated identity, he has to give up his search for infinite pleasure because it's a fantasy. So he puts a boundary. Why? Because under a threat, which Freud calls the castration complex, his organ of pleasure, the phallus, will be cut off by father. It comes internally. He is an atheist. So the father, when it brings on religion, he won't believe it, but it comes internally, organically. And he puts a limit and he consolidates his identity. He forms an identity. I am the holder of phallus. I'll have some pleasure, but not infinite pleasure. But the search for the infinite pleasure goes somewhere else. That's when his unconscious is born. Just as when our conscious is born, our unconscious is also born. Now, this pleasure principle he later refuted when he saw all the war and the Holocaust and so forth. He was of Jewish descent and he had to flee. His books were burned. He had to flee first to France, then to England, where he did his later work. He talked about a death principle, the thanatos. This is the eros, the life principle, the search for infinite pleasure, and the death principle. And he says they go side by side. What's very interesting is in Tantra and Indic philosophy, they are not opposed. The life principle and the death principle, the male and the female, they are intermingled. But in Freudian thinking, in the linear Abrahamic thinking from which he is coming from, he is only talking about the life principle, and then came the death principle. So the death principle is what incites our anxiety. Now let's go back and apply this to those who are unwilling to speak about the Hindu genocide. It's again the death principle of their identity, because their identity around what they have been taught, either in the Communist Party or in some family and so forth, what they have been taught is so strong that if they accept that their formulation, their paradigms are mistaken, Anyone can be a perpetrator, anyone can be a victim. And when they come face to face with that, it's the death of that identity that they're being taught. They come face to face with it. And then the anxiety, the death of their identity, maybe not the physical death, but the thanatos, that also creates anxiety. And so there's silence around that. They don't want to speak about it. So that's more or less the anxiety. There is an anxiety about speaking about the Hindu genocide. Why? Because, again, that whole herd mentality, the slave morality of Nietzsche is working. I've been taught this is the perpetrator and this is the victim. Just as in sexual violence, slowly through a lot of rallies, a lot of movement, a lot of writing, people have come to accept, yes, there's rape, there's public rape, that much acceptance is there, but not incestual rape, marital rape, that's not still accepted. Why? Because again, as I said in my last lecture, lecture 49, that rape was always a part of property law. So when a virgin was raped, her father was compensated. When a married woman was raped, the husband was compensated, because it's not about the woman, but about the virgin, about the father's property. But this again goes back to my first few lectures where I talked about woman, how she becomes a woman through the transaction. Again, it's a commodity property and all that. All these are connected. To make sense of one video, you have to go through the others. That's all for this video. My course on genocide, feminism, etc. will start in January. Please subscribe to this channel, like, comment, etc. I'll talk more about the course. For today, that is all. Thank you. Namaskar.